He spent Christmas on a yacht with his mistress. He came home to an empty mansion, divorce papers, and the disappearance of the one thing he never thought anyone would dare take: his son. If you've ever watched someone lose everything they believed was untouchable, stay until the end. This story will show you exactly how that happens and who made it happen. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The iron gates took 11 seconds to open. Damien Moretti counted them the way he counted everything, quietly, precisely, without expression. He sat in the back of the black Suburban, his jacket still smelling faintly of salt air and Elena's perfume, watching the two gates separate and reveal the long driveway lined with bare oak trees whose branches clawed upward at a sky the color of old pewter. Christmas was 3 days past. The decorators had been paid to string white lights along every branch from the gate to the front steps, and on the drive up from the airstrip he had pictured it. The soft glow diffused through the fog, the fountain frozen at its center, the mansion lit up the way it always was when he returned, because the staff knew when the dawn came home, the house came alive. The lights were off. Every single one. He registered this the way he registered most things that were wrong, a tightening somewhere behind his sternum that he would not call fear, because fear was something other men felt. He leaned forward and told the driver nothing. The driver, Marco, a thick-necked man from Providence who had worked for the Moretti family for 19 years, kept his eyes on the driveway and also said nothing. Marco had seen the lights. Marco understood what unlit windows meant in a house where the staff answered to the Don's household manager, and the household manager answered to the Don, and the Don never announced a return date that wasn't already prepared for. The Suburban stopped at the front steps. Damien got out without waiting for the door to be opened. He stood on the bottom step and looked up at the facade of the house. 4,200 square feet of Italian stone, facing that he had imported at enormous expense because his father had lived in a brownstone in Providence with peeling paint on the windowsills, and Damien had decided at the age of 17 that whatever he built would never peel. The windows were dark. The outdoor sconces were dark. The only light anywhere on the property came from the motion sensor above the front door, which clicked on the moment he stepped onto the porch, flooding him in cold white light. He pressed his thumb to the biometric panel. The lock disengaged. He pushed the door open and stood in the entrance hall. The Christmas tree was there, a 12-foot Fraser fir that his household manager, a meticulous woman named Dolores, had dressed with several $1,000s worth of ornaments and a lighting system that could be controlled from a phone app. It stood dark in the corner of the entrance hall, its ornaments catching the thin light from the doorway and throwing back small sparks of cold color: gold, silver, deep red. Around its base were wrapped presents still in their positions. The star at the top pointed at the ceiling like an accusation. The house smelled like no one had cooked in it for several days. Damien stood still for a moment, his hands loose at his sides, and let his eyes adjust. Then he crossed the entrance hall and turned on the overhead light and stood in the sudden brightness and looked around at a room that was exactly as it should be. Marble floors swept clean, the console table with its arrangement of white orchids, the staircase curving upward to the second floor, except that the orchids were slightly wilted, and the silence was the particular kind of silence that doesn't come from everyone being asleep. It comes from no one being home. There was an envelope on the marble console table, white, business-sized, his name printed on the front in a font he didn't recognize, which meant it hadn't come from anyone inside the organization, because everyone inside the organization knew to handwrite anything intended for his eyes. He picked it up. He didn't open it immediately. He carried it into the study off the entrance hall, turned on the desk lamp, sat down behind the desk, and set the envelope in front of him. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone and called the household manager's number. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He called the head of his residential security team. Same result. He called his housekeeper, a woman named Teresa, who had been with the household for 11 years and who he had never once had cause to contact directly because the household ran itself. Voicemail after 4 rings. He set the phone down. He looked at the envelope. Then he picked it up and opened it with the letter opener from the desk's center drawer, slitting the seal in a single clean motion, and removed the contents. There were 3 documents. The first was a petition for dissolution of marriage. The filing date was December 23rd, 2 days ago. The petitioner was listed as Vivian Marie Ashcroft, which was his wife's maiden name, not the name she had used in any legal document for the past 6 years. The respondent was listed as Damian Joseph Moretti. The grounds cited were irreconcilable differences. Attached to the petition was a motion for emergency sole legal and physical custody of one minor child, male, age 5. The child's name on the custody motion was not Moretti. Damian read the name printed there twice. Then he set that document down very carefully on the desk surface and picked up the third document. It was a certified copy of an amended birth certificate, his son's birth certificate. The child's surname had been legally changed. The amended certificate listed the mother's maiden name. The amendment had been processed December 22nd, 3 days ago, while Damian was eating Christmas dinner on a yacht anchored off the Florida coast with Elena Vasquez, who was 27 years old and had green eyes, and who he had been seeing for 2 years with the casual openness of a man who has never once believed consequences apply to him. He sat behind the desk for a long time. Marco appeared in the doorway after a few minutes, reading the silence correctly. "You need something?" "Where is she?" Marco's face was carefully neutral. "I don't know." The last confirmed sighting from the residential team was December 21st, afternoon. After that, the logs show nothing unusual, and then the 23rd check-in didn't happen. I didn't know until... Who was supposed to be watching this house? Cavello's crew, 4 men on rotation. "Get me Cavello." "He's not... Now, Marco." Marco left. Damian remained at the desk. He looked at the documents again, arranging them in a row on the desktop the way he arranged things when he was processing information, a habit from his father, who had said that organization was the difference between a criminal and a businessman. He looked at the dates. December 21st afternoon, last confirmed sighting. December 22nd, amended birth certificate processed. December 23rd, divorce petition filed. December 25th, Damian boards a return flight. December 26th, Damian finds an empty house. 5 days. She had 5 days of head start, and she had used every single one of them with a precision that didn't fit the woman he believed he had married. He had believed he married a woman who needed protecting. A woman from a decent but unremarkable Boston family who had been swept up by the gravity of what he was and had been grateful for the safety of his name and his walls. He had treated her accordingly, kept her comfortable, kept her provided for, kept her away from the uglier mechanics of how that comfort was produced. He had been, by his own accounting, a reasonable husband in the ways that mattered. She had a house, she had money, she had their son. The fact that she had also had no autonomy, no privacy, no friends outside the ones his organization had vetted, no movements outside the ones his security team logged. These were not things Damian Moretti considered cruel. They were practical. She was married to the head of an active crime family. The security protocols existed because the threats were real. The restrictions existed because loose associations created liability. He had explained this to her patiently in the first year of the marriage when she had still been asking questions, and after a while she had stopped asking, and he had read that as understanding. He understood now that he had been wrong about what the silence meant. Marco returned with Cavello on the phone. Damian listened for 3 minutes without speaking as Cavello explained that his team had seen nothing unusual, that Mrs. Moretti had been inside the house and behaving normally, that on the evening of December 21st she had gone to bed at the usual hour, and the next morning the residential detail had checked in at 6 as usual and found nothing alarming. No lights on early, no cars missing. It was only at the afternoon check-in that someone noticed the house was quiet, in a way it shouldn't be, and by then she was already gone, Damian said. "Yes, and you didn't call me." Silence on the line. "You didn't call me because you thought she'd come back. You thought she went to the grocery store or drove the kids somewhere. You didn't call me because calling me felt more dangerous than waiting." More silence. "I'll deal with you later," Damian said. Din said, and ended the call. He sat in the study for another 30 minutes, during which time he moved through something internal and private that he would never have named to another person. It wasn't grief. It wasn't panic. It was the particular sensation of a man who has controlled every environment he has ever entered, realizing that one of those environments has been controlling him, that the quiet, the compliance, the stillness he had interpreted as a managed household had actually been a woman watching and waiting and preparing carefully and patiently for the right moment. He thought about her hands. She painted. Watercolors mostly, pale coastal landscapes and abstract color studies that he had vaguely appreciated without ever actually looking at. She painted in the sunroom on the east side of the house, early in the mornings before their son woke up, and the paintings accumulated on a storage rack in the corner of the room, and sometimes she gave them away to the wives of his associates, who complimented them in the careful way women complimented things they didn't know how to value. He had never wondered what she was thinking while she painted. It had not occurred to him to wonder. He picked up his phone and called his consigliere. Sal Benedetti answered on the first ring, which meant Sal was awake at nearly midnight on December 26th and had been waiting for this call, which meant Sal already knew. "How long have you known?" Damien said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. "Since the 24th. Marco called me when the residential check-in failed. And you decided not to call me. I was trying to confirm before You decided not to ruin my Christmas." Another pause. "Sal," his voice was very quiet, "you let her get 2 extra days. I had people looking. I thought we'd find her before you landed. And? Nothing. She's gone, Damien. Her and the boy. Whatever she planned it for a while." He already knew that. What he wanted to know, saying what he found himself turning over in his mind the way you turn over a stone, expecting to find clean earth and find instead something that's been living underneath, was how long. How long had she been watching him? How long had she been collecting whatever she'd collected because the legal documents on his desk didn't get filed in a single afternoon? An amended birth certificate required an attorney and a court filing and a judge's approval. A divorce petition required grounds and evidence and strategy. She had done all of this without his knowledge inside his own house, surrounded by his own security detail. "I want to know who helped her," he said. "We're already working on—" "I want a name by morning." "Damien, by morning, Sal." He ended the call. He sat for another minute, alone in the study, and then he stood up and walked through the house. He turned on lights as he went. Entry hall, formal sitting room, dining room, kitchen. He opened the refrigerator and found it stocked and untouched, the way a refrigerator looks when the person who normally uses it hasn't been there in several days. He walked up the staircase and down the hall to the master bedroom, which was as he had left it before the trip. His side of the closet full, his nightstand undisturbed, and then he walked across the hall to the room that was his son's. He stood in the doorway. The boy's room was mostly intact. The furniture was there. The books were there. But the specific clutter of a 5-year-old's life, the particular toys that got slept with, the stuffed animal that went everywhere, the drawings pinned to a corkboard above the desk, those things were gone. The shelves held what remained, which was the surplus, the things that hadn't mattered enough to pack. She had packed for a life, not a trip. She had packed the way someone packs when they know they're not coming back. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he walked back down the hall to the study and made 4 more calls, each one brief and identical in substance. "Find her, report directly to me, tell no one else what you're looking for." By 3 in the morning, he had activated every surveillance and intelligence resource the Moretti organization controlled across 7 states. By 5, 2 private investigation firms, both with law enforcement backgrounds, both used previously for sensitive matters, had received photographs and personal details. By 7, the first of his capos called back to say they were on it, which meant every soldier under his command knew that the Don's wife had run with the Don's son, and the standing order was bring them back. He didn't sleep. He sat in the study as the winter light came up gray and thin through the windows, and he thought about his son's room with the corkboard stripped bare and the specific absence of the blue stuffed elephant that the boy had carried since he was an infant, and he thought about the fact that his wife had thought to pack the elephant, had known to pack it, had understood what the child would need in a way that was so precise and so maternal and so fundamentally about the boy's comfort that it made something in his chest constrict with a fury he couldn't entirely separate from something that felt, to his deep discomfort, like grief. He was not a man who grieved. He was not a man who felt the loss of things he had not adequately valued while he possessed them. He told himself this while the gray light spread across the study floor, while Marco sat in the hallway outside drinking coffee from a thermos and waiting for instructions, while the organization he commanded woke up across 7 states and began moving in his name. He told himself what he always told himself. He told himself this was a retrieval problem, a logistics challenge, a security breach to be identified, contained, and corrected. His wife had left. His son had been taken from the home that was his by birthright. The law, whatever temporary shelter it offered, was a mechanism Damien Moretti had been bending to his purposes since he was 22 years old, and a divorce petition and an amended birth certificate were paper, and paper burned. He told himself all of this. And underneath it, running like a current through cold water, was a different kind of knowing. The knowing that she had planned this, carefully and for a long time, which meant she understood things about him that he had not known she understood, which meant the version of his wife he had been living with was not the version that actually existed, which meant that for 6 years he had been married to a woman he had never actually seen. That was the part he couldn't strategize around. That was the part that sat in the room with him all night and didn't leave. Vivian Ashcroft, she was using that name now, not Moretti, the birth certificate was proof, had been standing in his house, sleeping in his bed, raising his son, for 6 years. She had been quiet and compliant and present in the careful, contained way of a woman who had learned exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. She had painted in the sunroom. She had attended the dinners and the events and the occasions that required her presence. She had smiled at his associates and their wives with the practiced warmth of a woman who knew her role. She had also, apparently, been memorizing. The first concrete evidence of how much she had memorized arrived at 8:37 in the morning when Sal called back. "We have a problem," Sal said. "Tell me." "The office in Newark, the secondary archive." Damien went still. The secondary archive in Newark was a storage facility maintained by Roman Vale, the organization's chief accountant, a meticulous man who had worked for the family for 12 years and who managed the financial architecture of the Moretti operation with a precision that had kept them ahead of 3 federal investigations. The archive contained backup copies of everything: financial records, encrypted ledgers, communications logs, property documentation. It was a failsafe. It was also supposed to be known to approximately 6 people in the entire organization. "What about it?" Damien said, though he already knew. "Vale didn't show up for his morning check-in. We sent someone to his apartment. He's gone. And the archive," Sal paused. "The digital partition has been accessed, copied. We don't know yet what's missing because the access was done in a way that didn't trigger the standard alerts, which means whoever did it knew how to avoid them. Vale helped her. It looks that way. Find him. Find him, Sal, and find out what she took. I need to know what she's carrying." He ended the call. He set the phone face down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the desktop and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. Roman Vale had worked for the family for 12 years. He was 51 years old, unremarkable in appearance, meticulous in habit, the kind of man who appeared in no photographs and held no title anyone outside the organization would recognize. He had attended the Christmas parties. He had shaken Damien's hand at Damien's father's funeral. He had sat across the table from Damien twice a week for over a decade, reporting numbers, explaining structures, moving money through layers of shell companies and legitimate businesses with the quiet competence of a man who understood that his value was exactly proportional to his invisibility. And he had given Damien's wife the keys to the kingdom. Damien thought about the expression on Vale's face the last time he'd seen him. A Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago, reviewing Q4 projections in this very room. The accountant had been his usual self. Careful, precise, slightly formal in the way of a man who had decided long ago that formality was his best protection. Nothing unusual, nothing that had registered. He was beginning to understand that he had developed a significant blind spot. He trusted the people closest to him because proximity had always felt like loyalty. He had interpreted silence as agreement, compliance as contentment, stillness as stability. He had looked at his household and seen a controlled environment and had not asked, had genuinely never asked, what the people inside it actually thought, what they actually wanted. what they were actually enduring. He pushed up from the desk and walked to the window that faced the frozen garden. The fountain was still. Ice had built up around the base of the stone cherub at the center, encasing it to the knees in a gray glaze. The grounds crew hadn't been in since before Christmas, which meant they either hadn't been called or had been told not to come, and he didn't know which. He had stopped knowing things about his own house. He turned away from the window and picked up the phone again and made the call he had been building toward since the moment he'd opened that envelope. Every capo, every soldier who ran anything. The message was the same. Find Vivian Ashcroft, find Roman Vale, find whatever they're carrying. This was not a request. This was not a situation where anyone waited for confirmation or checked in with someone else first. This was a directive from the head of the organization, and it was to be treated as the highest priority until further notice. He did not say, find my son. He did not say, bring my son home. Because his son was not a separate problem. His son was the only problem. The one at the center of everything else. The one he would not speak plainly about, because speaking plainly about it in an organizational context required acknowledging that his son was in danger, and that the danger came from the situation Damien himself had created, and that was a sentence he was not yet willing to finish. The calls took 2 hours. By 11 in the morning, the machinery of the Moretti organization was fully oriented toward a single target. She had taken his son. She had taken his accountant. She had taken, apparently, a significant portion of the documentary evidence that kept the organization running, the kinds of records that, in the wrong hands, or rather the right hands, could put men in federal prison for the remainder of their natural lives. She had taken all of this from inside the walls he had built to contain her, and she had a 5-day head start. 3 states away, in a motel room with blackout curtains and a heating unit that clanked every 40 minutes like something was loose inside it, Vivian Ashcroft sat on the edge of the second bed and watched her son sleep. He was breathing with his mouth slightly open, the blue elephant tucked under his left arm, his dark hair fanned out against the pillow. He was wearing pajamas she had packed, the ones with the small green tractors on them that he had picked out himself at Target 6 months ago on one of the rare supervised shopping trips where she had been allowed to take him somewhere ordinary and public, and where she had stood in the children's clothing aisle and watched him hold up pajamas with tractors and grin at her. And she had thought, clearly and without drama, I am going to get him out. That had been the decision. Not a plan yet, just a decision. The plan had taken the remaining 6 months. She looked at him now in the motel room's dim light, the lamp on the desk on its lowest setting, because he still didn't like sleeping in complete dark, and felt something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't relief, not yet. It wasn't triumph, because she knew better than to think she had won anything. It was something closer to the feeling of having held your breath for a very long time and finally, just barely, surfaced. She pulled out her phone, a prepaid device purchased with cash 4 weeks ago, and sent a text to the only contact stored in it. 2 words. We're safe. The response came in under 2 minutes. Stay put. Coming to you. Roman Vale, who had, over the course of 4 years of watching Damien Moretti treat the people around him as instruments of his will, arrived at a private accounting of his own, the kind that had nothing to do with numbers. He had helped her because she had finally asked, directly, and because he was a man who had been keeping his own books in private for a long time, and those books did not balance in Damien's favor. He was also, she was fully aware, a man who had helped build the machine she was trying to escape, which meant his guilt was not clean, and she did not trust him without reservation, but she trusted him enough. Sometimes enough was all you had. She set the phone face down on her knee and looked at her son. His name was Oliver. Not Oliver Moretti, not anymore. Oliver James Ashcroft, which was the name on the amended birth certificate that a family law attorney named Gareth Moss, a man who had represented several women in situations like hers, and who had a reputation for handling sensitive matters with discretion, had helped her file through a jurisdiction 3 states removed. She had driven there herself, on one of the days when Damien was in a meeting in the city and the security rotation was lighter, telling the residential details she was taking Oliver to a pediatric checkup, which she was. She had simply also done 2 other things on the same trip. She had filed the paperwork. She had met Roman at a coffee shop near the pediatrician's office and received from him a thumb drive containing enough documentary evidence of the Moretti organization's operations to occupy a federal task force for the better part of a year. And then she had driven back to the mansion and made dinner and supervised Oliver's bath time and sat at the table across from the security detail's evening check-in and smiled the particular smile she had spent 6 years perfecting. The one that said, "Everything is fine. I am content. I belong here." The night before she left, she had stood in the sunroom and looked at the paintings stacked on the storage rack. She had wanted to take them. She had left them because she couldn't carry everything, and the paintings could be made again, and her son could not be replaced. But leaving them had felt like leaving a part of herself behind in that house, which was perhaps the point. She was leaving the version of herself that had agreed to disappear inside those walls, and the paintings were that version's artifacts, and they belonged to the past. She had taken only what mattered. Oliver. The thumb drive. Her own documents. Enough cash to maintain independence for several months. The blue elephant. And now she was sitting in a motel room with blackout curtains listening to her son breathe and trying not to calculate how far Damien's reach extended, because she already knew the answer, and the answer was very far. She had not escaped. She knew that. She had created distance and deployed legal protections and activated resources she had spent 6 months assembling, but Damien Moretti did not stop because someone filed paperwork. He stopped because he was made to stop. And making him stop required something more permanent than a custody order, which was why the thumb drive mattered as much as Oliver's birth certificate. It was also why she needed to reach the person Roman had told her about, the retired federal judge. The one who, according to Roman, had been quietly building a case against organized crime networks for the better part of 3 years, and who had been waiting, with the patience of someone who understood that durable cases required durable evidence, for exactly the kind of documentation that was currently stored on a thumb drive inside the inner pocket of Vivian's coat. She hadn't made contact yet. She was waiting for Roman. She was also, she acknowledged to herself in the dim light of the motel room, afraid. Not the kind of afraid that paralyzes. She had been navigating that kind of afraid since the 3rd month of her marriage, when she had understood for the first time that the walls were not for her protection. This was a cleaner fear. The fear of a woman who has made a move and committed to it fully and is now in the space between action and consequence, where all you can do is wait and hold still and trust the plan you built in the only privacy you were allowed, the sunroom, early mornings, while a child slept upstairs and armed men sat in cars outside, and a husband conducted his business in rooms she was not permitted to enter. She had built the plan in the margins of a life that had been designed to leave her no margins. She thought it was good. She was about to find out. Oliver stirred in his sleep, turned over, pulled the elephant tighter under his arm, and went still again. She watched him for another minute. Then she turned off the desk lamp and lay down on her own bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the clanking of the heating unit and counted the hours until Roman arrived. And underneath the counting, underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the raw awareness of how much was still unresolved, there was something she had not felt in 6 years. She was on the other side of the walls. Whatever came next, she was on the other side. Roman Vale drove through the night with a rented car that couldn't be traced to his name and a laptop bag on the passenger seat containing encrypted copies of everything he'd given her. And then some. The redundancy of a careful man who had spent his career ensuring that no single point of failure could bring down the entire structure. He was afraid too. He didn't pretend otherwise. Damien Moretti had resources that Roman had personally helped build, and those resources were now oriented toward finding him. And Roman was 51 years old with a bad knee and no operational experience in the kind of situation where armed men came looking for you. What he had was information, and a belief, arrived at too late and at too high a cost, that information was not neutral. Information held by the wrong people was a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. He had spent 12 years pointing that weapon for a man who used it without scruple and without consequence, and he was tired. A bone-deep, marrow-level tired that had nothing to do with the hour or the miles. And he was done. He drove through the dark with the laptop bag beside him and the miles accumulating, and he thought about the evidence on the thumb drive and what it would mean when it reached the right hands. And he thought about Damien's face when he opened that envelope, and he felt something he would also not have been able to name precisely. Not satisfaction, not righteousness, something more provisional and complicated than either of those. He thought, let it be enough. He drove. Miles behind him, in a mansion with its lights finally on and its iron gates locked from the inside, Damian Moretti sat behind his desk and looked at the divorce papers and the amended birth certificate and did not sleep, and thought the same thing that every man in his position thought when the thing he most underestimated turned out to be the thing that brought him down. He thought, I never saw it coming. He was already calculating how to make that irrelevant. He picked up the phone. Sal, he said when it connected, I want every road out of the tri-state area covered by morning. Banks, border crossings, airports. I want Vale's financials frozen. I want her attorney identified, and I want someone sitting on his office by noon. A pause. And I want someone to find out who she's been talking to. Not just recently. Going back 2 years. Every call, every message, every name. That's going to take... Do it anyway. He ended the call and sat back in the chair and looked at the dark window. 3 states away, a child with a blue elephant slept in a blackout curtained motel room, and somewhere in the space between a father's fury and a mother's plan, the next move was already in motion, though neither of them yet knew exactly whose it was. Roman arrived at the motel at 4:20 in the morning. Vivian heard the car before she saw it, the specific sound of tires on wet asphalt moving slowly, cautiously, the way someone moves when they're checking the lot before they commit to stopping. She was already sitting up in the dark when the headlights swept briefly across the gap in the blackout curtains. She waited. 30 seconds. Then a knock. 3. Pause. 2. The pattern they'd agreed on in the coffee shop 3 weeks ago, said once and never written down anywhere. She opened the door. Roman Vale looked like he had aged 5 years in the past 4 days. He was a compact man, normally precise in appearance, the kind of man whose collar was always straight, whose shoes were always polished, who existed in a state of careful maintenance that Vivian had always understood was armor. Right now the collar was open, the shoes were mud-streaked, and there were shadows under his eyes so deep they looked bruised. He stepped inside without speaking. She closed and locked the door. He set the laptop bag on the desk and stood for a moment with his back to her, hands on the desk's surface, head down, and she understood he needed 60 seconds to decompress from the drive before he could talk. She gave them to him. Oliver slept on. Roman turned around. He looked at the boy, then at her. He okay? He's fine. He thinks we're on an adventure. Something moved across Roman's face that wasn't quite a smile. Smart. Keep it that way as long as you can. He pulled out the desk chair and sat down heavily. Damian knows about the archive. She had assumed this. How much does he know? He knows it was accessed. He knows I'm gone. He doesn't know the full inventory of what was copied, but he'll figure it out. He'll give that task to the one person in the organization smart enough to reconstruct it, and that person will work backward from what we have and understand what we took. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. The stubble made a dry sound. He'll know by the end of the week. Then we need to move before the end of the week. We need to move before the end of tomorrow. He reached into the laptop bag and produced a second thumb drive, identical to the one she carried, matte black, the size of a finger. That's a copy, different encryption key. You carry one, I carry one. If something happens to one of us, don't. Vivian. His voice was flat, not unkind. We are in a situation where something happening to one of us is a realistic scenario, not a hypothetical. I need you to carry that drive, and I need you to know the contact information for Judge Whitmore, and I need you to be able to proceed without me if it comes to that. I need you to hear what I'm saying. She took the drive. She held it for a moment, then put it in her coat pocket next to the other one. Tell me about Whitmore. Helena Whitmore. Retired federal judge, 22 years on the bench. She left 3 years ago, which everyone assumed was health-related. It wasn't. She's been embedded with a joint organized crime task force ever since. Unofficial capacity, no salary, no title, which means no public record of her involvement. She has relationships with 3 U.S. attorney offices and direct access to the supervisory team that's been trying to build a RICO case against the Moretti organization for the better part of 4 years. Why hasn't the RICO case gone anywhere? Because they've been missing the financial architecture. He tapped the laptop bag. The shell companies, the layering structure, the political contributions routed through legitimate PACs, the real estate transactions used to clean the weapons revenue. They've had the edges of it, but they've never had the center. What's on those drives is the center. Vivian processed this. So we're the missing piece. You are. I'm the person who can't explain what the documents mean to someone who doesn't speak forensic accounting. He looked at her steadily. I've been preparing to testify for 8 months. I just needed someone to survive long enough to make the testimony useful. She stared at him. 8 months? I started copying files 8 months ago, slowly, carefully, in amounts that wouldn't trigger the internal audits. I have been building toward this for 8 months, and I did not know if it would ever actually happen. And then you came to me in that coffee shop and said, I need your help, and I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought, all right, it's happening. She didn't know what to say to that. The motel room felt very small and very real. The clanking heating unit knocked twice and went quiet. Why? She said. He understood what she was asking. He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which had always made him easier to trust than the ones who answered too fast. I kept the books for 6 operations that ended with people dead, he said. I didn't pull triggers. I moved money. But the money made the triggers possible, and I understood that. And I kept doing it because I was afraid, and because I was well compensated, and because I told myself the books didn't have blood on them. He looked at his hands. They had blood on them. Silence. The contact for Whitmore, she said. He gave her a number. She memorized it. He gave her an address, a law office in a mid-sized city 2 states northeast that functioned as a secure meeting point for the task force's confidential informants. She memorized that too. She had become, over the past 6 months, very good at memorizing things, a skill developed out of necessity because she couldn't write anything down in a house where every surface was potentially observed. We can't go together, Roman said. 2 people traveling with a child is easier to track than 1. I'll reach out to Whitmore's office tonight and set up the contact. You take Oliver and get to the address. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours is a long time. I know. If Damien has the roads covered, he has the major routes covered, which is why you're not taking a major route. He pulled out a folded paper map, actual paper, which struck her as both antique and exactly right, and spread it on the desk. He had marked a secondary route in pencil, switching between state roads and county highways, avoiding any corridor that would show up on a standard route analysis. It added 4 hours to the drive. It also avoided every toll plaza with camera coverage on the direct route. You stop for gas only at stations I've marked, cash only. No cards, no phone calls, no digital anything. The prepaid is clean, but if he has someone inside the carrier, he has someone inside the carrier, she said. I know. So the phone goes off and stays off until you reach the address. You check in with me through the secondary number I gave you from a payphone at this location. He pointed to a mark on the map. Gas station outside Carver's Mill. It still has a payphone. I checked. She looked at the map. She looked at the route. She thought about Oliver in the back seat for 8 hours on secondary roads in winter, with the blue elephant and probably a lot of questions she would have to answer without frightening him. Okay, she said, get a few hours of sleep. Leave at 7. It'll be full light by then, and you won't be driving tired in the dark. Are you sleeping? He looked at her with an expression that suggested he found the question genuinely novel. I'll be fine. She turned off the lamp and lay back down in the dark. She did not sleep. She listened to Oliver breathe and to the heating unit and to the faint sound of Roman at the desk, the very quiet clicking of a keyboard, a man doing whatever a man does when he spent 8 months building towards something and the moment has finally arrived and there's nothing left to do but wait for morning. In the Moretti Estates study, morning arrived with a phone call that Sal Benedetti made at 6:47 and that Damien took standing at the window, still in the clothes from the night before, a cup of coffee in his hand that had gone cold 2 hours ago. The attorney, Sal said, Gareth Moss, family law, handles high-sensitivity divorces. He has a reputation for working with women in... complicated domestic situations. Where is he? Boston. He filed the divorce petition and the custody motion. He also has a relationship with a legal aid organization that specializes in, I don't need his biography. I need to know what he knows and what he's told her. Damien, he's an attorney. There are limits to what we can shot. There are no limits, Sal. Find out what he knows. I want to know if she's told him about Vale. I want to know if she told him what she was taking. And I want to know who else in her support network he's aware of. A pause. How do you want us to approach that? However gets me the information. He said it without inflection, the way you state a coordinate on a map, and left Sal to understand what it meant. Then, and I want Marco to go to Boston personally. I want Moss to understand that representing Vivian Ashcroft in any proceeding going forward carries consequences. Another pause. Longer. Damien, if we intimidate her attorney, she can bring that to the court, and she can bring whatever she wants to whatever court she wants. His voice was still quiet, which Sal knew was worse than loud. I need Moss to understand the situation. That's all. He ended the call. He set the coffee cup on the windowsill and stood with both hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the frozen garden. He was thinking about Roman Vale. 12 years. He was thinking about what Roman would have had access to. Every layer of it, the full financial architecture, the shell structure, the political contributions, the real estate vehicles. He was thinking about what that documentation looked like in the hands of a federal prosecutor. He was not panicking. He did not panic. But he was, for the first time in a long time, doing a specific kind of internal calculation that he usually reserved for situations where the organization was under direct external threat, running scenarios, assessing exposure, identifying which nodes in the network were most vulnerable if the documentation reached the right audience. The answer, which arrived with unpleasant clarity, was that most of the nodes were vulnerable. Roman had been meticulous. That was the quality Damien had valued in him, and it was the quality that was now positioned precisely against him. Because a meticulous accountant building a case against the organization he served would produce meticulous documentation, the kind that didn't have gaps or ambiguities, the kind that was designed from the beginning to survive legal scrutiny. He had trusted Roman because Roman was useful. He had given Roman access because access was necessary. He had never once asked what Roman thought about the work he did, because it had not occurred to him that what Roman thought was relevant. He pressed one palm flat against the cold window glass. There was a sound in the doorway. He turned. It was Tommy Cavello, the security captain he had spoken to the night before. Cavello was a broad man in his mid-40s, ex-military, with a face that had weathered into something that looked permanently compressed, as if his features were bracing for impact. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, an actual hat, a wool cap held at his waist, and his expression was the expression of a man delivering news he would rather not deliver. "What?" Damien said. "The Vale thing. We've been going through the apartment. He took clothes, some cash, we think, and the laptop. But he left his car." He left his car. In the parking structure, which means he either had another vehicle staged or someone picked him up, and we didn't catch it because... Cavello stopped. Because no one was watching Vale. Damien said it without accusation, which was somehow worse. Why would anyone watch Vale? Vale was Vale. Yes. And now Vale is gone with my financial records, and my wife and my son are 3 states away, and you're standing in my doorway holding your hat. Cavello said nothing. He was smart enough for that. "Go," Damien said. Cavello went. Damien turned back to the window. He stayed there for another minute, very still. Then he made a decision. The kind that, once made, reorganizes everything downstream of it, the way a dam break reorganizes a river. He picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 4 years. It rang twice. "Damien." The voice on the other end was smooth and slightly amused, which was its default register regardless of circumstance. Vincent Caruso, who operated out of Chicago and who had interests that overlapped with the Moretti organizations in exactly 2 areas, transportation corridors and political relationships. and who Damien had maintained a careful, arm's-length détente with for the better part of a decade, because Caruso was useful as an ally and genuinely dangerous as an enemy. "Vincent, it's early. I have a situation. I heard." A pause in which Damien understood that Caruso had indeed heard, that whatever had happened inside the Moretti household was already circulating through the networks that connected the major organizations, because these things always did, and the only variable was how the story was being framed. "Your wife left. She took something that belongs to me. The boy. Among other things." Caruso let that sit for a moment. "What do you need?" "Eyes on secondary routes northeast. I have the majors covered. I need someone watching the smaller corridors, the state roads, the mountain passes, anything that bypasses the toll infrastructure." "That's a significant coverage area." "I know what it is." "And in return?" "Name it." A longer pause this time. Caruso was the kind of man who treated pauses as currency. He spent them carefully, and he expected the other person to understand what they were costing. "The Camden Avenue property," he said finally. "Clear title, no encumbrances, transferred within 60 days. The Camden Avenue property was a commercial building in Newark that the Moretti organization had used as a logistics hub for the better part of 6 years. It was worth approximately $4 million and had a locational value that exceeded its assessed price. Giving it to Caruso would shift a small but meaningful piece of the regional distribution network in his direction. Damien thought about this for 3 seconds. "Done. I'll have people on the secondary routes by this afternoon. I need them by noon." "By noon," Caruso agreed without any indication that he found the request unreasonable, which meant he'd already had people half mobilized, which meant he'd anticipated the call, which was a fact Damien filed and did not comment on. He ended the call. He had just paid $4 million in a strategic logistics position to chase his wife across 3 states. He was aware of the absurdity of this. He was also aware that the absurdity was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was that Vivian Ashcroft was carrying documentation that, in the right hands, would dismantle everything he had spent 20 years building, and she was also carrying his son. And those two things were not separable, and the only resolution available to him required recovering both. He went upstairs for the first time since he'd returned. He showered and changed and stood in the bathroom looking at his own face in the mirror for a moment. The face that had sat across courtroom appearances and negotiating tables and the occasional congressional inquiry without flinching. The face of a man who had been told since childhood that he was built for exactly this kind of pressure. He looked tired. He hadn't looked tired in years. He went downstairs and ate something standing over the kitchen counter, whatever Teresa had last left in the refrigerator, which turned out to be leftover pasta that he heated in the microwave and consumed without tasting. He needed to eat. He needed to function. Fatigue was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was something other men had. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. Not in his contacts, not a pattern he knew. He almost let it go. Then something made him answer. "Mr. Moretti." A woman's voice, measured with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being the authority in any room she occupied. "My name isn't important. What's important is that you understand that what you're looking for is no longer simply a domestic matter." "Who is this?" "Someone who would prefer to resolve this quietly, which means I need you to understand, before you escalate any further, that the material your wife is carrying has already been partially transferred to a secure location outside your reach." The kitchen was very quiet. "Partially," he said. "Partially. Which means you still have an interest in reaching an accommodation." He felt something shift in the room's temperature, or maybe in his own chest, a recalibration of the situation's dimensions. This was not a bluff call from Vivian's attorney. This was someone else entirely, someone who knew about the documents and was calling him directly and using the word accommodation, which was a word people used when they had leverage and were choosing not to deploy it immediately. "What kind of accommodation?" he said. "The kind where your son grows up healthy and away from your organization. The kind where you retain your freedom in exchange for a structured cooperation on financial matters." A pause. The kind where nobody has to explain to a jury what the Camden Avenue property was really used for. She knew about Camden Avenue. He had offered it to Caruso less than 20 minutes ago. "I'll call you back on this number," he said. "It's a one-time number, Mr. Moretti. This conversation ends in 4 minutes." He stood in the kitchen with the phone against his ear and thought very fast. She had the documents or access to them. She knew about Camden. She was calling him before fully deploying the leverage, which meant she wanted a resolution that didn't require the full detonation of what she was holding. She was offering him a version of survival that involved surrendering his son and restructuring his financial exposure, which was not a deal he was going to take, but the fact that she was offering it meant she wasn't certain she could destroy him cleanly, which meant there was still room to maneuver. "You have Vivian," he said. "I have a relationship with someone who does. Tell me where she is." "Mr. Moretti, tell me where she is and I will meet you in person and we will discuss your accommodation." His voice was absolutely level. "That's the only conversation I'm having." Silence on the line. 4, 5, 6 seconds. 48 hours, the woman said. "I'll send you a location." The line went dead. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, his phone in his hand, the cold pasta half eaten on the counter beside him. Then he went back to the study and sat down behind the desk and opened his laptop and pulled up the call log and stared at the number. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived 20 years by reading situations accurately, that the woman on the phone was not calling on Vivian's behalf. She was calling on her own behalf or on behalf of something larger. She knew about Camden Avenue in real time, which meant she had surveillance on his communications, which meant she had resources that exceeded a family law attorney or even a private investigator. He thought, federal. He thought, this is already a federal situation. And then, underneath that, colder and more specific, she said partially transferred, which means the rest is still in transit, which means Vivian is still moving. He picked up the phone and called Marco. "The route coverage," he said when Marco answered. "I need it tightened. Not just the roads, hotels, motels, short-term rentals, anything in a 200-mile corridor northeast. Pull in whoever you need. That's going to be visible," Marco said. "That many people moving, someone's going to notice." "Good," Damien said. "Let them notice. Let her know we're close." He paused. Panic makes people move faster than they should, faster than they planned. He ended the call. He was wrong about that, about panic making Vivian move faster than she planned. He would not understand until much later how wrong he was. Because the woman he had been married to for 6 years, the woman he had never adequately looked at, had spent 6 months building a plan with no room in it for panic. She had anticipated the coverage on the major routes. She had anticipated the private investigators and the corrupt officials and the network of favors being called in across 7 states. She had anticipated most of it because she had watched him operate for 6 years, and watching Damien Moretti operate was an education in exactly how a man like him responded when something he considered his was taken from him. She had built her plan around his predictability. What she had not anticipated was the phone call he'd just received, because the woman who had called, the one with the measured voice and the 4-minute window, was not working with Vivian. She was working alongside Vivian's situation, in parallel, for reasons of her own. And the call had done something Vivian's plan had not accounted for. It had told Damien that the federal infrastructure was already aware and already partially positioned, which meant he had less time than he thought, which meant the next 36 hours were going to compress everything, his search, his response, his options, into a window so narrow that whatever happened inside it would determine everything that came after. He sat at the desk and looked at the blank screen and thought about his son sleeping somewhere with a blue stuffed elephant, and about the woman who had stood in his house for 6 years and memorized the shape of his blind spots. He picked up the phone one more time. "Sal," he said, "change of plans. I'm going north personally." "Damien, that is not—" "Have a car ready in 30 minutes and call off Caruso's people on the northeast secondary routes." "Why?" "Because I don't want Caruso anywhere near what's about to happen." A pause. "This stays inside the family from here. No outside contractors, no favors, no alliances. Just us." He could hear Sal processing this. The shift in strategy, the withdrawal from the extended network, the decision to move personally rather than by proxy. "You think she's going to the feds," Sal said. "I think she already has." He stood up from the desk. "Which means we have one move left, and I'm going to make it myself." The study was very quiet. Outside, the frozen garden caught the thin winter light and threw it back flat and gray. The empty fountain, the locked gates, the bare oak trees. 30 minutes, he said, and ended the call and went to get his coat. Vivian left the motel at 7:04 in the morning. She had packed everything the night before. There wasn't much, 2 bags and Oliver's small backpack with the things he'd need accessible during the drive. She carried him to the car still half asleep, the elephant wedged under his arm, his head heavy on her shoulder with the particular dead weight of a child who hasn't fully woken up. She buckled him into the back seat and he stirred and said something that wasn't quite a word, and then settled back against the door with his eyes closed. She put a blanket over him. She stood outside the car for a moment in the cold air, her breath visible, the parking lot empty in every direction. She got in. She started the engine. She pulled onto the access road without turning on the headlights until she reached the main street. Roman's map was on the passenger seat, folded to the first leg. She had memorized the route, but she wanted the map there anyway. Something physical, something she could touch. The first turn was 8 miles east, then a county road running northeast through farmland and small towns with names she didn't know. She drove at exactly the speed limit. She did not speed, she did not slow down. She held the car at a constant velocity and watched every vehicle that appeared in the rearview mirror and assessed it and then let it pass out of her attention when it turned off or fell back. Oliver woke up around 8:30 when the sun was fully up and they were deep into the secondary route, the road narrowing through a stretch of bare-limbed forest that pressed close on both sides. He looked out the window for a moment, collecting himself, and then said, "Are we still on the adventure?" "Still on the adventure. Where are we going today?" "To see some people who are going to help us." He thought about this. Good people or bad people? She glanced in the rearview mirror. His face was serious in the way 5-year-olds are serious when they've picked up on something the adults around them are trying to keep from them. She had been careful not to let fear show in her voice, or her face, or her hands, and she thought she had mostly succeeded, but Oliver had spent 5 years watching the adults in his life move and speak in a house where the emotional weather changed without announcement, and he had developed, as children in those environments do, a sensitivity to the unspoken that was almost physical. "Good people," she said. "People who want to help us be safe." He accepted this. He reached forward and put the elephant on the center console between the front seats. "Eli can ride up front," he said. "He likes to see where we're going." She reached over and adjusted the elephant so it was propped against the dashboard, facing forward. "Good call." He watched the trees go by for a while. Then he said, "Is Daddy going to find us?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Not if I can help it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." And he looked back out the window with an expression she caught in the mirror, not afraid exactly. Something older than afraid. Something that made her chest hurt in a way she didn't let reach her face. She drove. The first sign that something was wrong came 90 minutes outside Carver's Mill, when she rounded a long curve and saw a black SUV parked on the shoulder of the county road a quarter mile ahead. Not a police vehicle, no markings, just sitting there with the engine running. She could see the exhaust in the cold air, and a single figure visible through the windshield. She didn't slow down. Slowing down was the wrong move. She maintained her speed and drove past and looked straight ahead, and in her peripheral vision registered the SUV's driver watching her, and then she was past it and checking the mirror and it hadn't moved. She breathed. She kept driving. 3 miles later, she checked the mirror and the SUV was behind her. Not close, a quarter mile back, maybe more. Staying at a consistent distance. Following. She did not panic. She had planned for this contingency. There was a turnoff 2 miles ahead that Roman had marked in pencil, a farm road that connected to another county highway and added 12 miles to the route, but bypassed the next 8 miles of the current road. She watched the mirror and drove, and when the turnoff appeared, she took it without slowing. A smooth, deliberate turn, nothing hesitant about it. She watched the mirror. The SUV didn't take the turn. She gave it 30 seconds. A minute. The turnoff receded behind her and the farm road stretched ahead, unpaved and rough, the car jolting through frozen ruts. Still no headlights in the mirror. She exhaled slowly. She reached Carver's Mill at 11:20. The gas station was where Roman said it would be. A small independent station at the edge of town, 2 pumps and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s. And the payphone was there, mounted on the exterior wall beside the entrance, which seemed impossible and necessary in equal measure. She filled the tank with cash. Oliver used the bathroom and came out with a package of crackers that she hadn't said he could get, but also didn't take away. She stood at the payphone and dialed the secondary number Roman had given her. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. She hung up, waited 2 minutes, dialed again. This time it was answered on the second ring, but the voice was not Roman's. It was a man she didn't know. He said, "Mrs. Moretti." She hung up immediately. She stood at the payphone with her hand still on the receiver and felt the cold of the metal through her glove and felt her heart rate do something it hadn't done since she'd left the motel. A sharp, disorganizing lurch, the kind that temporarily disassembles your ability to think in sequence. She breathed through it, in through the nose, out through the mouth, 4 counts each, the way she had taught herself in the sunroom during the years when she had needed a mechanism for surviving the space between her own thoughts. She looked at Oliver through the car window. He was eating the crackers and looking at something outside the opposite window, unaware. The secondary number was compromised, which meant either Roman had been found, or the number had been intercepted, or there was something she didn't know about the structure of Roman's safety protocols that had created a gap. She could not determine which. She could not call anyone to ask. She had no way to reach Roman except through that number, and that number now led somewhere else. She had 2 thumb drives in her coat pocket and a 5-year-old in the back seat and a route she had memorized from a pencil-marked paper map, and the only contact point she had for Judge Whitmore was an address that was still 6 hours away. She got back in the car. "Ready?" Oliver asked, as if she'd stepped out for something routine. "Ready," she said. She pulled out of the gas station and back onto the road. She made herself think in sequence, made herself go through the options the way Roman had trained her to think about contingencies. Not emotionally, not catastrophically, one variable at a time. The address for Whitmore's contact point was still good. Roman had given it to her verbally, and she had memorized it, and it hadn't been written down anywhere, which meant that even if Roman's number was compromised, the address was something she was carrying only in her own memory. Unless Roman had been taken and had given the address under pressure, in which case the address was a trap, and she was driving toward it. She drove and thought about Roman Vale, his careful face, his careful hands, the way he'd sat at that motel desk in the pre-dawn and said, "I kept the books for 6 operations that ended with people dead." She thought about the 8 months of preparation he'd described. She thought about a man who had been building toward this for that long, and she tried to assess whether someone like that, if taken and pressured, would give up the address. She didn't know. She hadn't known Roman long enough or well enough to know what he did under extreme pressure. She had trusted him because she had no other option, and because her read of him had been that his guilt was real and his commitment was genuine. But a read was not a certainty, and certainty was something she had long since stopped expecting. She drove for another hour, watching the mirror, and then she stopped at a roadside rest area and sat with the engine running and made a decision. She was going to the address. She had nowhere else to go and nothing else to go toward. If it was a trap, she would know when she arrived. She would know before she committed to the approach, because she would come in cautiously and watch first. She was not going to drive her son into a situation without looking at it first. She was going. She pulled back onto the road. She did not know that Roman Vale had been found at 7:15 that morning, approximately 40 minutes after she left the motel. He had been parked in a rest stop 20 miles east of the motel, trying to get 2 hours of sleep in the front seat before driving to Whitmore's contact point by a separate route. He had not heard the car that pulled in beside him. He had woken to the sound of both passenger doors opening simultaneously, front and rear. and by the time his body had caught up with his mind, he was already contained, one man holding his arms and another controlling his head, efficiently and without drama, the way people who do this professionally do it. They had taken the laptop bag. They had taken his phone. They had driven him, in his own rented car with one of them behind the wheel and the other in the back seat beside him, to a location he didn't recognize. A commercial property of some kind, a warehouse, or light industrial space. Empty, the kind of property that exists at the edge of every mid-sized American city without attracting notice. Marco had been there. Marco was running the operation, which told Roman that this was not a freelance action. This was the Don's direct reach, which was both expected and, in the reality of it, more frightening than the abstract version. They sat him in a chair in the middle of an empty room with a concrete floor and fluorescent lights, and Marco stood in front of him with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm and said, with the patience of a man who does not enjoy what he does but has done it enough to be efficient at it, "Where is she?" "I don't know," Roman said. This was true. He genuinely did not know her current location. He knew the route, he knew the address she was heading toward, but he did not know where she was on the route at this moment, and he told himself that this distinction mattered. He was not certain it mattered. He told himself anyway. Marco looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Roman, I've known you for 12 years. I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending I'm going to enjoy this." "Then don't do it. Tell me where she's going." Roman's knee was aching from the cold and from the position of the chair, and he looked at Marco's face, which was exactly as it had always been, compressed, weathered, professionally neutral. And he thought about the address he was holding in his head, and he thought about Vivian in a car somewhere on a secondary road with a child, and a blue stuffed elephant and 2 thumb drives that represented the only thing that made her situation survivable. "I can't tell you that," he said. Marco nodded, as if this were the answer he'd expected. He turned and spoke briefly to one of the other men, and then turned back, and Roman understood that the next several hours were going to be very bad, and there was nothing he could do to change that, and the only variable within his control was what he said, and when he said it, and how long he could hold on to the address before the math of pain overrode the math of principle. He was 51 years old with a bad knee and no particular history of physical endurance, and he was fully aware that he was not the kind of man who holds out indefinitely under pressure. He was not a soldier. He was an accountant. He had never claimed to be otherwise. But he knew something Marco didn't know yet. The address was only meaningful for the next 18 hours. After that, Whitmore's contact point rotated, a security protocol that Roman had been informed of when he'd first established the channel, designed precisely for the scenario where a location was compromised under duress. If he could hold the address for 18 hours, it became useless. Vivian would arrive, the meeting would happen, and whatever Marco's men found when they eventually reached that address would be an empty law office. 18 hours was a very long time. He looked at the fluorescent light above him and took a breath and decided that 18 hours was what he was going to give her. Damien arrived at the staging location at 9:47 in the morning, driving himself, which he had not done in 3 years. He had sent the driver home in Providence and taken the car alone, which had alarmed Sal enough to call twice during the drive, both of which Damien had let go to voicemail. He walked into the warehouse space and looked at Roman Vale sitting in the chair and felt nothing that he would have described as satisfaction. It was something more operational than satisfaction. Roman was a resource that had been redirected and needed to be redirected again. He sent everyone else outside. Marco started to object, and Damien looked at him, and Marco went outside. He pulled a second chair from against the wall and set it facing Roman and sat down in it, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, the posture of a man having a conversation. Roman looked at him with the expression of a man who has already made some private decisions and is now simply waiting to see how events unfold. Damien looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way he had not looked at the people around him apparently, for a very long time. "You've been planning this for 8 months, he said. Roman said nothing. "I'm not asking. I worked it out from the access logs." He studied Roman's face. 8 months ago, you started copying files. 8 months ago is around the time the task force began making moves that were more targeted than their previous pattern, more specific, better informed. I didn't connect it at the time because I was looking for external leaks. He paused. I wasn't looking at the room. Roman still said nothing. His jaw was set. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had dried into a dark line. I want to understand something, Damien said. Not for operational reasons. I genuinely want to understand. He leaned forward another inch. Why her? Of all the exits available to you, why did you make her part of this? Roman looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, She asked. That's it. She came to me and she asked for help, and she was... He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up. She was the only person in that house who ever asked me anything about myself. In 12 years. One conversation in the kitchen, 3 years ago, she asked me if I was happy doing what I did. Nobody in that organization had ever asked me that. Not once. His voice was even. I told her I didn't think happiness was the right metric. And she said, What is the right metric then? And I couldn't answer her. He held Damien's gaze. I've been thinking about that question for 3 years. Damien sat back slightly. He looked at the man across from him, the careful face, the careful hands folded in his lap now, the cut drying above the eyebrow. And he felt something that was deeply inconvenient and that he pushed away immediately, but that he noted in passing, the way you note a warning light on a dashboard when you're driving somewhere you've already committed to. Where is she going? He said. I don't know. Roman, I genuinely don't know where she is on the road. I know the direction. I don't know the position. Then tell me the direction. Roman looked at the fluorescent light. He looked at Damien. He seemed to be doing a calculation that had nothing to do with numbers. Northeast, he said. That's not enough. That's what I have. Damien studied him. He was lying, not about the direction that had the ring of partial truth, which was usually how useful lies were constructed. He was lying about the specificity. There was a destination. There had to be a destination because Vivian did not move without plans, as he now understood with a clarity that felt like being shown something that had been in front of him for years. The judge, he said. Something moved in Roman's face, very fast, very small, controlled, but not fast enough. Damien stood up. Thank you, Roman. Damien, you're going to stay here for a while. You're not going to be hurt further as long as you stay where you are. He said this the way he said everything, without particular emphasis, without cruelty, which was somehow the most threatening register. He picked up the chair and set it back against the wall. The judge is a variable I already have. You've confirmed it, which is helpful. He walked toward the door. She's already won, Roman said to his back. Whatever you do in the next 24 hours, the documents are already beyond your reach. You know that. Damien stopped walking. He stood with his hand on the doorframe and his back to the room. The documents are one problem, he said without turning around. My son is another. Those are not the same problem. He pushed the door open. I'm only trying to solve one of them. He went out into the cold. Vivian reached the address at 4:17 in the afternoon, well after dark had started falling, the winter sunset compressing the day to almost nothing. The law office was on a quiet commercial block in a mid-sized city whose name she had known only from a map until this morning. 3 stories, brick face, a brass nameplate beside the door that listed 2 attorneys whose names she didn't recognize. She parked across the street. She sat in the car with the engine off and watched for 9 minutes. The block was quiet. 2 other cars parked in front of the building, a light on the 2nd floor. Nothing that triggered the specific alarm she had learned to trust. The physical thing in her chest that had been right every time during 6 years of living inside a system designed to deceive her. We're going inside, she told Oliver. Is this where the good people are? This is where the good people are. She took both thumb drives from her coat pocket and held them for a moment. She put one in the interior zip pocket of her bag. The other she kept in her coat. She got Oliver out of the back seat, and she took his hand and they crossed the street. The door was unlocked. The reception area was empty. After hours, no staff. A lamp left on in the corner. A staircase to the right. She had been told to go to the 2nd floor, ask for the office at the end of the hall. They went up. The hall was carpeted, quiet. the kind of quiet that wasn't alarming. She could see light under the door at the end. She walked toward it with Oliver's hand in hers, and she knocked. "Come in," said a woman's voice. Measured, slightly amused at the edges. The same voice she had heard described by Roman, the voice she had been building toward for 6 months. She opened the door. The office was small and warm, lit by a desk lamp and a floor lamp in the corner. Books on 2 walls. A desk with a clear surface and 2 chairs across from it. And behind the desk, a woman in her mid-60s with white hair, cut short, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the face of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the stakes were high and has developed, through long practice, an expression of absolute steadiness. Helena Whitmore looked at Vivian. She looked at Oliver. Then she looked back at Vivian and said, "You made it." "I made it," Vivian said. Her voice was almost steady. "Sit down." Whitmore looked at Oliver. "There are books on the shelf behind you if you find the grown-up conversation boring, which I expect you will, because it is going to be very boring." Oliver considered the bookshelf with visible interest. He took the elephant and went to investigate. Vivian sat down. She reached into her coat pocket and set the thumb drive on the desk. Whitmore looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at Vivian instead. "Roman Vale has been taken," she said. "We became aware approximately 3 hours ago." Vivian felt the floor of her stomach drop. "Is he alive as far as we know? But Damien Moretti is aware of this location. Not the address specifically, but the concept. He knows you're moving toward a federal contact point. He confirmed it from Vale, or from Vale's reaction to a question. It amounts to the same thing." She leaned forward slightly. "Which means we have a window, and the window is closing, and I need to know what's on that drive before it closes." Vivian looked at the drive on the desk. She thought about Roman in a chair in a warehouse somewhere, holding an address in his head, bleeding above the eyebrow, buying her 18 hours. She thought about 18 hours becoming 4. "Everything," she said. "The full financial architecture, shell companies, layering structure, the political contribution routing, the real estate vehicles, 12 years of ledgers." She met Whitmore's eyes. "Roman Vale is prepared to testify as to the meaning and context of all of it, if you can get him out. Getting him out requires knowing where he is. Can you find that?" Whitmore looked at her for a moment with the steadiness that was her natural register. "We have resources. But Vivian," she said the name as if she'd been using it for years. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change what you thought this situation was." Something in the sentence's shape made Vivian's shoulders go tight. "Tell me." Damien Moretti has been under active federal surveillance for 11 months, not just the task force, a separate operation initiated by the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district. Whitmore picked up the thumb drive then, finally, turned it in her fingers. "The operation has a cooperating witness, someone inside the Moretti organization who has been providing real-time intelligence for the past 8 months. Vivian waited. "The witness is not Roman Vale," Whitmore said. Vivian heard the next sentence before it was spoken. She heard it in the way Whitmore paused before saying it, in the particular weight of what wasn't being said. "The witness is Salvatore Benedetti," Whitmore said, "Damien's consigliere, his closest advisor, the man who has been managing the response to your disappearance." She set the drive down. "Sal Benedetti has been feeding this office operational intelligence for 8 months, Vivian, which means every move Damien has made since you left that house has been known to us in advance." She paused once more. "Including the decision to go north personally, including the call to Caruso, including the location of this office, which Sal confirmed to us 4 hours ago when Damien told him where he was going." The room was very quiet. Oliver was on the floor with a picture book, turning pages with the focused deliberateness of a child absorbed in images. Vivian sat in the chair and looked at the desk surface and let the information rearrange itself inside her. Sal Benedetti, who had been at every dinner, every occasion, every event during 6 years of her marriage, who had spoken to her with the careful, slightly formal courtesy of a man maintaining professional distance, who had, She was realizing now, with the particular nausea of retroactive understanding, been the person who first raised the question 2 years ago in a conversation she had partly overheard of what would happen to the child if the domestic situation became legally contested. Sal, who had drafted, apparently, a plan to strip her of parental rights. Sal, who had done this, Roman had told her, on Damien's order. Sal, who had also, simultaneously, been telling the federal government everything. He drafted the plan to take Oliver from me, Vivian said. Yes. While working for you. The cooperation agreement doesn't specify which of Damien's directives Sal is required to obstruct. It specifies which information he's required to provide. Whitmore's voice was even, not without empathy, but even. He's an informant, not a protector. The distinction matters. Vivian sat with this. She sat with the knowledge that the man who had helped architect the plan to separate her from her son had also been the reason the federal case against her husband was as advanced as it was, and that these two things were true simultaneously, and that there was a version of this information that was clean. What does this mean? She said. For me, for Oliver. It means that when Damien arrives at this location, and he will arrive within the next few hours, he's not going to find what he expects to find. Whitmore stood up. She was taller than she looked sitting down. Because we're not going to be here. She moved to the window and looked out at the street below for a moment, then turned back. There are federal agents outside this building right now. 2 vehicles. They've been here since this afternoon. The moment Damien Moretti crosses the threshold of this address, he's walking into the conclusion of an 11-month federal operation. She looked at Vivian steadily. But the custody protections I'm filing tonight are contingent on your testimony about the domestic situation, in addition to the financial evidence. And your testimony requires you to be present and willing. I'm present, Vivian said. And willing? She looked at Oliver on the floor with his picture book. She thought about the walls of the mansion. She thought about the security logs and the approved friendship lists and the supervised shopping trips and the sunroom in the early morning and the paintings she had left behind because she couldn't carry them. She thought about 6 years of learning the shape of a man's blind spots from the inside. Yes, she said. Whitmore nodded. She picked up the thumb drive and crossed to a laptop on a side table and inserted it. She typed for a moment. Then she looked up. There's one more thing, she said. Her voice had shifted, still even, but with something in it that Vivian recognized as the pre-shape of a hard sentence. The operation's timeline was moved up, tonight, not because of your arrival, though that's helpful, because of something Sal reported 2 hours ago. She looked at Vivian directly. Damien made a phone call this morning that we intercepted. Before he went north. She paused. He called someone about the boy. Vivian went very still. He has a secondary plan, Whitmore said, in the event that he can't recover Oliver through direct retrieval. The plan involves a custody proceeding in a jurisdiction where he has a cooperative judge filed on an emergency basis, combined with a motion to have your departure from the marital home characterized as parental abduction. She held Vivian's gaze. If that filing lands before we can execute tonight, it creates a legal complication that could tie up Oliver's custody for months in a proceeding where Damien still has significant local influence. When does the filing land? Vivian said. 8 o'clock tonight, unless we move first. It was 5:43 in the afternoon. Vivian looked at her son, who had finished the picture book and was now looking up at her with the elephant in his lap and the expression of a child who has been patient long enough and is ready to know what happens next. Tell me what I need to do, she said, and outside on the quiet commercial street, a pair of headlights turned the corner and moved slowly toward the building, and the 2 federal vehicles parked in shadow did not move, and the clock on Whitmore's desk read 5:44, and everything that was going to happen in the next 2 hours was already in motion, converging from every direction at once toward a single point. The small warm office, the desk lamp, the woman with white hair and steady eyes, and a mother sitting across from her who had rebuilt herself from the inside out, over 6 years of being told she was nothing, and who was now, at 5:44 on a winter evening, the most dangerous thing in the room. The headlights didn't stop at the building. Vivian watched from the edge of the window. Whitmore had told her to stay back from the glass, and she had, but she could see the angle of the street from where she stood, and the vehicle that had turned the corner moved slowly past the law office without stopping and continued down the block and turned again. "Recon pass," Whitmore said. She was on a phone, speaking quietly, her back to the room. "He's confirming the location before he commits." Vivian pulled back from the window. Oliver was still on the floor, but he'd stopped looking at the book. He was watching her. She went to him and sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged, the way she sat with him at home when they read together, and she kept her voice absolutely level. "We're going to move to a different room in a few minutes," she said. "There's going to be some noise outside. I need you to stay close to me and not make any sound. Can you do that?" He looked at her. He held the elephant by one ear, the way he held it when he was thinking seriously. "Is it like hide and seek?" "Exactly like hide and seek." "Okay." He pulled the elephant into his lap. "Eli's good at hiding." "I know he is." She stood up. Whitmore had ended the call and was moving with a purposefulness that was neither rushed nor slow, the movement of someone executing a prepared sequence. She went to the desk and closed the laptop and put it in a bag. She unlocked a door in the side wall that Vivian hadn't noticed because it was flush with the paneling, opening into a short corridor that connected to what appeared to be a rear stairwell. "There are 2 agents at the back of the building," Whitmore said. "You and Oliver go with them. They'll take you to a secondary location 4 blocks east, a federal field office, unmarked building. You wouldn't know it from the street." She handed Vivian a laminated card with a photo ID that wasn't hers. "If anyone stops you between here and there who isn't one of my people, you show that and say nothing else. Do you understand?" "Yes." "The filing." Whitmore looked at her watch. "We have an attorney on the phone with the family court right now. Emergency motion, judge is on standby. Your testimony has been pre-submitted in affidavit form. I had your attorney, Moss, prepare it 3 weeks ago on my request. The custody protections land in the next 30 minutes regardless of what happens in this building." Vivian absorbed this. Moss, who she'd thought was only handling the divorce petition, had been coordinating with Whitmore for 3 weeks. Another layer of the structure she hadn't fully seen. She found she wasn't angry about it. She was something else. Something closer to the feeling of being caught in a current you'd thought you were navigating, realizing it was moving faster and further than your own paddling. "And Damien," she said. "Damien walks into a building that has 6 federal agents in it and approximately 2 years of predicate offense documentation on his organization." Whitmore's face was steady. "What happens next is what was always going to happen next. We just needed the evidence you're carrying to make it durable." She looked at Oliver, then back at Vivian. "Go." Vivian took Oliver's hand. He stood up immediately, elephant under arm, ready. She looked at him for 1 second. The small, serious face, the dark eyes that were his father's shape but held something his father's eyes never had. And then she moved. They went through the side door and into the stairwell, which smelled of concrete and cold air, and at the bottom a door opened from the outside before she reached it, held by a woman in a dark jacket who said, "Mrs. Ashcroft," with the brisk professionalism of someone for whom this was Tuesday, and Vivian said yes, and they were outside in the cold, moving fast. Damien made his second pass at 6:03. He stopped the car half a block from the law office and sat for a moment looking at the building. The light on the second floor. 2 other vehicles parked out front that he had cataloged on the first pass. A dark sedan and a panel van, both sitting still, both with the specific quality of vehicles that are occupied but showing no activity, which was not how parked vehicles normally looked and which told him everything he needed to know about what was in them. He had come north with Marco and one other man, Renzo, who sat in the back seat now and said nothing. He had told Sal he was going alone. He had told Sal this deliberately because at some point during the drive north, a thought had arrived that he had not permitted himself to examine too closely, but that had begun reshaping his understanding of the past several days. Sal had known, from the first phone call the night Damien returned to the empty mansion, exactly where things stood. Sal had recommended calling off Caruso's people on the secondary routes. Sal had been the one to say this morning that the situation needed to stay inside the family, advice that Damien had followed, which he had thought was his own decision. He sat in the car and looked at the building and thought about the woman who had called him on a number that hadn't been in his contacts, the one-time number, the 4-minute window, the voice that had known about Camden Avenue 20 minutes after he'd agreed to it. He thought about the only people who could have known about that call in real time. He had known for about 90 minutes. He had not said so. He had driven north with Marco and Renzo and had not said so because knowing and acting were two different things, and acting required a plan, and the plan was still forming. He looked at the second-floor window. "She's already gone," he said. Marco turned from the passenger seat. "What?" "The light's still on, but the activity signature is wrong. A woman with a 5-year-old doesn't sit quietly in a lit room when she knows we're outside. There's no movement, no shadow. They've moved her to the back." He looked at the parked vehicles again. "Those are federal, which means we're sitting outside a federal staging location with whatever we have between us." He paused. "Which is nothing useful." Marco said nothing. Renzo, in the back, shifted his weight. Damien sat with his hands on the wheel. He was 52 years old and had operated in conditions of significant pressure for 30 years, and he knew how to read a situation that had turned against him, and he was reading this one clearly. The building in front of him was not a target. It was an endpoint. The evidence was inside it or already transmitted, and the agents in those vehicles were not there to negotiate. He thought about his son. He thought about Oliver's room with the corkboard stripped bare and the particular toys gone and the blue elephant absent from the shelf. He thought about a custody filing landing in a family court in the next 30 minutes that would, combined with the emergency protections Whitmore had presumably already initiated, create a legal structure around his son that would take years to dismantle. Years during which Damien would be navigating a federal RICO indictment that would consume every resource and every relationship and every remaining piece of political cover he had managed to maintain. He thought about what Roman had said in the warehouse. "She's already won." He had said, in response, "I'm only trying to solve one problem." He was still trying to solve that problem. The documentation was gone. He had known that since the warehouse, had accepted it with the cold clarity of a man who has learned to amputate what cannot be saved. The organization would take damage. How much damage depended on what the task force could do with the evidence and how much of the network could be restructured before the indictments landed. These were problems with solutions, even if the solutions were expensive and painful and involved a period of significant exposure. His son was not a problem with a solution if he sat outside a federal building and waited for 30 minutes to pass. He started the car. "Where are we going?" Marco said. "The secondary location." He pulled away from the curb, moving slowly, without urgency, a vehicle leaving because it has somewhere else to be. "She's 4 blocks east." Marco turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I know this city. There's one unmarked federal field office in this district, and it's 4 blocks east of where we're sitting." He turned at the corner. "She's going there. She has to." "Damien, if we approach a federal field office, we're not approaching it. We're getting there first." His voice was quiet. "She hasn't arrived yet, which means there's a window between where she is right now and where she's going, and that window is closing, and I need to be inside it." Renzo leaned forward from the back seat. "What do you want to do when we find her?" Damien didn't answer immediately. He drove. He turned onto a cross street and then another, orienting by memory toward the block he had identified, and he thought about what he wanted to do when he found her. The answer that came was not the one he would have given 24 hours ago. 24 hours ago, he would have said, "Bring her back." He would have said, "Contain the situation." He would have said there were legal avenues, there were judges, there were mechanisms. What he understood now, sitting in a car in a city 3 states from his home, having just confirmed that his closest advisor was a federal informant and his organization's financial architecture was in the hands of a task force, was that there were no mechanisms left. There was no version of legal avenues that ended with his son in his house. There was no judge with enough remaining cover to take on a custody case backed by federal emergency protections and a 12-year evidentiary record. He had spent his entire adult life being the person in the room who held the most leverage. He no longer held any leverage. The thing that he was driving toward, the window between where Vivian was and where she was going, was not a retrieval operation. He understood this somewhere beneath the level of words. It was something else. He drove toward it anyway because stopping was not something he knew how to do. He came around a corner and saw them, Vivian and Oliver, moving fast on the sidewalk, flanked by 2 people in dark jackets, half a block ahead, moving away from him. He stopped the car. In the back seat, Renzo started to open his door. "Don't," Damien said. Renzo stopped. Damien sat in the stopped car with the engine running and watched his wife walk away from him on a winter sidewalk with his son's hand in hers. Oliver was on her left side, half a step behind her, keeping up with the adult pace, the elephant visible even from this distance, tucked under the small arm. The two agents flanking them were close, but not touching. Professional spacing. He watched them for 4 seconds. Then Oliver looked back. It might have been nothing, a 5-year-old looking at the street behind him for no reason, the random orienting behavior of a child in an unfamiliar environment. It might have been the sound of the car stopping. Whatever it was, Oliver turned his head and looked back down the block, and for a moment, a single, calibrated moment in the winter dark, he was looking directly at his father's car. Damien didn't move. Oliver turned back and kept walking, matching his mother's pace, and they reached a door set back in a building facade, and the door opened from inside, and they went through it, and the door closed. Damien sat. Marco was watching him from the passenger seat, not speaking, not moving, just watching. "There's a warehouse on the south edge of the city," Damien said finally. "Roman is there." "I know. Call and have him released." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Damien, call and have him released, Marco." Another moment of quiet. Then Marco took out his phone. Damien put the car in gear. He drove south. He did not look back at the building where his son had just disappeared. He drove with the particular deliberateness of a man making a decision that has no good version, only the version you can live with and the version you can't. And sometimes living with something is not about comfort. Sometimes it is simply about what you choose to do with the knowledge of what you've already cost. The field office was smaller than Vivian had expected. A conference room with a table and chairs, fluorescent lighting, a whiteboard still covered with someone else's notations from a previous meeting. An agent had brought Oliver a juice box and a granola bar, with the slightly awkward care of someone who is not accustomed to having children in the building, but is trying. Oliver sat at one end of the table with his juice box and regarded the whiteboard with interest. Whitmore arrived 8 minutes after Vivian. She came in without taking off her coat and went directly to the end of the table where a laptop had been set up and spoke to the agent seated there in a voice too low for Vivian to hear. Then she straightened and looked at Vivian. "The custody filing landed," she said. Vivian breathed. "Emergency sole custody, effective immediately, pending full hearing. The order also includes a geographic restriction. He cannot be within 500 feet of you or Oliver until the hearing." She paused. "The hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks out. By which point the indictments," Vivian said. "By which point the indictments," Whitmore confirmed. Vivian sat down. The chair was plastic and slightly too cold and entirely real, and she sat in it and looked at her hands on the table surface and felt the past 6 months, all the weight of them, the planning and the fear and the careful performance of contentment inside those walls, come down on her at once, not collapsing, but settling, like something that has been held at tension finally allowed to rest. Oliver looked over at her. "Mom, does the granola bar count as dessert or a snack?" She looked at him. "What do you think?" He considered this with great seriousness. "Snack," he decided, "because it has oats." That's correct reasoning. He went back to the granola bar. She looked at the table. Outside it had started to snow. She couldn't see it from where she was sitting. No windows in the conference room. But one of the agents had come in and said something to a colleague, and she had heard the word snow, and she thought about the drive she had made today. The bare-limbed forest pressing close on both sides, the frozen ruts of the farm road, the single payphone at the gas station in Carver's Mill. All the miles between the motel parking lot and this room. Her phone buzzed. The prepaid, which she had turned back on when they entered the field office. An unknown number, which she almost didn't answer. She answered. "It's me," said Elias Mercer. She had not spoken to him in 4 days, not since the night before she left the motel, a brief call to confirm he was in position at the location they had agreed on, the remote cabin that was supposed to be the fallback. He was a former military trauma surgeon who had treated 3 of her husband's men over the years, quietly, off-book, the way the organization handled medical situations that couldn't go through official channels, and who had, over those years, developed a detailed understanding of what the Moretti organization was and how it operated, and a corresponding conviction that he did not want to keep being useful to it. He had reached out to Vivian through a mutual contact 8 months ago. He had been part of the plan from nearly the beginning. "Are you safe?" he said. "We're safe. We're at the federal location." A silence in which she heard him exhale. A long, controlled exhalation that told her he had been holding that breath for a while. "Oliver?" "He's eating a granola bar and has opinions about it." A sound that was almost a laugh. "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." Damien's people came to the cabin. A pause. "About an hour ago. 3 vehicles. They went through everything. I was already gone. I'd had a feeling earlier this afternoon, and I moved out." He paused again. "But they found it, Vivian, which means they knew about the cabin, which means someone in the chain between you and me was talking." She sat very still. "Or they tracked it through me. The prepaid—" "I don't think it was the prepaid. The carrier check would have led them to the motel area, not directly to the cabin. Someone in the support chain gave the location." His voice was careful. Even. The voice of a man who has seen serious situations and learned to report them without amplifying the panic. "I'm not saying who, I don't know who. I'm saying it was known." She looked at Whitmore, who was still at the other end of the table, now speaking on her own phone. She thought about the chain of people who had known about the cabin. Herself, Elias, Roman, and the attorney Moss, who had helped coordinate several elements of the plan and who had apparently also been in contact with Whitmore for 3 weeks. She thought about the one-time phone call she had received in the car, the voice she hadn't recognized, the call she hadn't made. She thought about all the things that had been happening in parallel to her plan. The federal operation, Sal's cooperation, the pre-submitted affidavit, the attorney she'd thought was simply filing her divorce petition, working 3 weeks ahead of what she'd known. She thought about a structure she had built carefully, inside which other structures had been building simultaneously, and the question of how many of those structures were aligned with her and how many were simply using the same corridor. "Elias," she said, "where are you now?" "About 2 hours from your location. I'm driving." "Come here. Come to the field office." She looked at Oliver, who had finished the granola bar and was now examining the empty wrapper with the focused interest he applied to everything. "We need to debrief everything together, with Whitmore present. All of it. The cabin, the chain, who knew what and when." "Okay." "And Elias," she lowered her voice, "thank you for the 8 months." A pause. "Don't thank me yet. Get through tonight first." He ended the call. She set the phone on the table. Whitmore had ended her own call and was looking at Vivian across the table with an expression that had shifted slightly. Still steady, but with something in the steadiness that now looked like the surface of water over a current. "The cabin was found," Vivian said. "I know." Whitmore sat down across from her. "We tracked Damien's vehicles to that location approximately 40 minutes ago. By then you were already here, so it didn't change our timeline. You knew about the cabin. We became aware of it through the surveillance on Damien's communications. Which means if you knew, other people in the operation might have—" "Vivian." Whitmore's voice was quiet and direct. "There is a version of this conversation that takes us down a path of examining every possible breach in every possible chain. And that conversation is important and will happen, but it cannot happen in the next 20 minutes, because in the next 20 minutes, I need your full testimony, on record, and I need the second drive." She held Vivian's gaze. "Can you do that right now?" Vivian looked at her. She looked at Oliver, who had given up on the granola bar wrapper and was now trying to make the elephant sit upright in the chair beside him, with the serious logistical focus of a child for whom this was the current primary problem. She reached into her coat pocket. She put the second drive on the table. "Start recording," she said. The agent at the laptop nodded and typed a command. A small red indicator light came on at the edge of the screen. Whitmore folded her hands on the table and looked at Vivian with the formal attentiveness of a woman who has heard a great many testimonies and knows what a credible one sounds like from the first sentence. Vivian straightened in the chair. She took one breath. And then from outside, muffled by the building's walls but audible, the specific sound of a disturbance at a door, raised voices, and then a single sharp impact that was not quite a knock and not quite something worse, and one of the agents in the room came to immediate attention and moved toward the corridor, hand at the side of the jacket, and the red recording light continued its steady pulse, and Whitmore did not move, did not turn her head, did not break eye contact with Vivian, and in the chair beside her, Oliver looked up from the elephant and said very quietly, "Is it still hide and seek?" And Vivian put her hand on his and said, "Yes, baby, stay with me," and kept her eyes on Whitmore and heard the corridor go quiet again, and heard a different voice, a voice she recognized from a distance of years and walls, say something in the short, clipped syntax of a man who has arrived somewhere he knows he has no right to be and is arriving anyway. And the agent in the corridor said something short and hard back. And then there were footsteps. And then the door to the conference room opened. Damian Moretti stood in the doorway. He was alone. No Marco, no Renzo, just him, in the coat he had worn for 2 days, with the look of a man who has driven 3 states on no sleep and arrived at the end of something and knows it. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at the agent who had come in behind him with a hand still at his jacket. Then he looked at Vivian. He looked at Oliver. The boy looked back at his father with the direct, undefended gaze of a child who has not yet learned to make his face say something other than what he feels. And what his face said was complicated. Recognition and something that might have been longing and something else underneath that which Vivian couldn't read and didn't try to, because she was watching Damian's face, and what she saw there was something she had never seen in 6 years. Not fury, not calculation, something that looked briefly and unmistakably like a man seeing himself clearly for the first time. "Mr. Moretti," Whitmore said. Her voice was exactly what it had always been. "You've entered a federal facility without authorization." "I know what I've entered," Damian said. His eyes hadn't left Oliver. "Then you understand that the next thing that happens is your choice, and your choice alone." He stood in the doorway. Oliver held the elephant up slightly, the way he held it when he was uncertain, not hiding behind it, just keeping it close. He didn't speak. He looked at his father with the open, honest attention of a 5-year-old, and his father looked back at him from the doorway of a federal field office, and the red recording light pulsed, and Vivian's hand tightened on her son's. "Daddy," Oliver said. One word. Damian's jaw moved. Something happened in his face that Vivian would not describe to anyone later, because it was private in a way that not even her testimony could reach. He looked at Vivian. She met his eyes. "It's done," she said. Not with triumph, not with anger. The flat, unadorned register of a true statement that doesn't need decoration. His hands were at his sides. The agent behind him was still, waiting. The red light pulsed. Damian Moretti stood in the doorway of a room that held the end of everything he had built, and his son looked at him with the elephant held close, and outside it was snowing, and the only sound was the ventilation system and the distant, muffled city and a 5-year-old's breathing, and Damian looked at his son for a long time. Longer than strategy required, longer than the situation warranted, long enough that it stopped being about the situation entirely. Then he looked at the agent behind him and said, with the exhausted precision of a man who has finally run out of moves, "I'm not armed." He put his hands up, and the room came apart into motion. The agent moving, Whitmore on the phone, a second agent appearing from the corridor. And through all of it, Oliver sat in his chair and watched, and Vivian kept her hand over his and didn't look away. They processed Damian Moretti in a room down the hall from where his son was eating a second granola bar. Vivian heard it. Not the words. The walls were thick enough for that. But the rhythm of it, the back and forth of an arrest proceeding, the specific cadence of rights being read and acknowledged, and the bureaucratic machinery of consequence engaging, gear by gear, with the patient indifference of a system that does not care how powerful you were yesterday. She sat in the conference room and listened to the rhythm and kept her hand on the table near Oliver's and did not go to the window and did not try to hear more clearly. Oliver had stopped asking questions. He was drawing on the back of a legal pad one of the agents had given him. A house, it looked like, with a tree beside it and what was probably meant to be the elephant standing in front. He drew with the focused concentration of a child for whom the act of making a mark on a surface was sufficient occupation, complete in itself, requiring no context. She watched him draw. Whitmore came back into the conference room at 7:41 and sat across from Vivian and put both hands flat on the table in the way of someone settling in for a different kind of conversation. The formal attentiveness was still there, but the recording light was off. "His attorney is on the way," Whitmore said. "He'll be processed here and then transferred to federal custody pending arraignment." She looked at Vivian steadily. "The indictment was ready. It's been ready for 6 weeks. We were waiting on the financial documentation to make it durable enough to survive a defense team of the caliber he'll be able to afford. And now it's durable. Now it's very durable." She paused. "Sal Benedetti's cooperation agreement includes testimony on approximately 40 predicate offenses. With the documentation you brought, we can corroborate most of that testimony with documentary evidence, which is what turns a cooperating witness into a conviction." She looked at the table for a moment. "You should know that Benedetti's cooperation was not altruistic. He was approached by this office 14 months ago following a separate investigation, given a choice, and made a rational calculation. That's the nature of it." "I know," Vivian said. "Roman told me what kind of man Sal was. And yet the plan to take Oliver from you, the custody proceeding he was helping to draft." "He was doing his job," Vivian said, "which was to serve Damien's interests while also serving yours. Both things were true at the same time." She looked at her son's drawing. The house had a door now and a small square window. "I've learned to hold two true things at once. It takes practice." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need, practically, tonight and in the next several weeks?" "Roman first. He's being collected. The men at the warehouse have been... The situation is being handled. He'll be brought here or to a medical facility, depending on his condition." Whitmore's voice didn't shift on the word medical, which was professional, but Vivian felt it. "How bad?" "We don't know yet." Vivian sat with that. She sat with Roman in a warehouse chair, holding an address for 18 hours for a woman he'd known for 6 months, for reasons that came down to a question asked in a kitchen 3 years ago about whether happiness was the right metric. She sat with what that cost and did not try to make it smaller. "He needs full immunity," she said. "Whatever he cooperates with, whatever testimony he gives, I want his immunity agreement to cover his 12-year exposure completely. Not partial, complete." "That's not my... Make it your decision." She met Whitmore's eyes. "He built the case that makes your indictment durable. He started copying those files 8 months before I walked into a coffee shop and asked for help. He was doing this before I was doing this. He deserves the same protection I'm getting." Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment. "I'll make the call." "Tonight." "Tonight," Whitmore agreed. Oliver looked up from his drawing. "Mom, does the house need a garage?" She looked at the drawing. "Does your house have a garage?" He thought about this. "Our new house will," he decided, and went back to drawing. She looked at the word "our" and felt it move through her like something warm and specifically physical, the way certain words do when they carry more weight than their letters account for. "I need a place to stay," she said to Whitmore. "Something safe, not a hotel, for a few weeks until the hearing." "We have a safe house." "Not a safe house. A house. Something that looks like a life, not a protocol." She said this quietly, without apology. "He's 5. He needs something that looks like a life." Whitmore considered. "I know someone. A colleague. She has a property she uses for similar situations. It's not federal, it's private. I can make a call." "Please." Whitmore nodded and stood and left the room again. Vivian turned back to Oliver and his drawing. The garage had materialized in the lower right corner, a small square with a door. She watched him work the pencil across the paper and thought about the sunroom, the stack of paintings on the rack, the pale coastal landscapes and color studies she had left behind in the house she would never go back to, and whether leaving them there had been an act of abandonment or an act of intention. Leaving behind the evidence of years spent making beauty in the margins of a life that was trying to erase her. She thought she'd get them back, eventually, through the legal process, through the asset proceedings that would follow the criminal case. Most of what was inside those walls would become subject to seizure and forfeiture, and she would not see it again. But paintings were personal property, non-fungible, hers in a way that federal asset proceedings generally acknowledged. Or she would make new ones. That thought arrived clean and without drama. She would make new ones, different ones. Whatever she painted after this would not look like what she'd painted inside those walls because she was not the same person, and the paintings would know that even if she didn't yet. Tis. Elias arrived at 8:20. She heard his voice in the corridor before she saw him. The specific cadence of it, lower than most, measured in the unhurried way of a man who had learned in operating rooms that panic is a luxury and clarity is a practice. He was talking to an agent, explaining who he was, and then the door opened and he was there. He was 6 feet, lean, with the kind of face that had started ordinary and been made distinctive by years of paying close attention to things that mattered. He had a cut on his hand that she noticed immediately. Dried, not fresh, from something that had happened at the cabin. He looked at her. He looked at Oliver. Something in his face did what it did when he was processing relief, which was not a dramatic expression, just a very slight easing, like a building settling. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. Oliver looked up. He had not met Elias in person before. They had spoken twice on a video call that Vivian had managed through the prepaid device, brief and careful. Oliver studied him with the frank assessment of a child meeting someone his mother clearly trusts. "You have a cut," Oliver said. Elias looked at his hand. "I do." "Does it hurt?" "Not much anymore." Oliver appeared to find this satisfactory. He returned to the drawing. Elias sat in the chair Whitmore had vacated and looked at the drawing over Oliver's shoulder for a moment. "Nice garage," he said. "It's going to have a red door," Oliver told him. "Good call." He looked at Vivian. She looked at him. There was a conversation in the look, not the conversation they would eventually have, the one that would take weeks and would be halting in the way honest conversations are when they involve two people who have shared something extreme and are now trying to understand who they are to each other on the other side of it. That conversation was weeks away. This was something shorter and more primary. "You're alive. I'm alive. The boy is fine." "The cabin," she said, "you stripped clean. They went through everything. Didn't find anything that mattered because I'd already moved everything that mattered." He set the laptop bag. He had the second laptop, the backup, on the table. "I don't know who gave them the location. Whitmore thinks it came through the surveillance on Damien's communications. He may have been tracking secondary contacts from the beginning, not following us directly, but following the network." "Moss?" "Possibly, or just good counterintelligence." She paused. "It doesn't matter now. It matters for next time." "There isn't a next time. This is done." She said it with the flatness of a true statement. "The indictment is in. The custody order is in. Whatever happens next happens in courtrooms with attorneys, and that's a different kind of war." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you okay?" She thought about the question. She thought about what okay meant, specifically in the context of the past 6 days and the past 6 years. She thought about the honest answer, which was not simple. "Not yet," she said, "but I'm going to be." He nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a granola bar, a different kind than what Oliver had been given, darker chocolate, and set it on the table. "I grabbed it from a gas station. Figured someone might be hungry." She picked it up. She ate half of it. It tasted like a gas station granola bar, which is to say it tasted like nothing much, and also like exactly what it was, and she was grateful for it in a way that was disproportionate to the thing itself, the way you're grateful for small, tangible things when the large, intangible things have been in motion for so long. Roman Vale arrived at the field office at 9:53, in the company of 2 federal agents and a paramedic who had assessed him at the warehouse and cleared him for transport without hospitalization. He had 2 cracked ribs, a laceration above the eyebrow that had been closed with adhesive strips, and a bruise on the left side of his face that had progressed from red to a deep purple that made him look, in the field office's fluorescent light, like something painted by someone who didn't flinch from color. He walked in on his own. Slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose ribs reminded him of themselves with each breath, but on his own. Vivian stood up when he came in. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at Oliver, who was asleep in his chair with the elephant in his lap and the half-finished drawing on the table in front of him, his head tilted to one side in the way of a child who has decided sleep is more interesting than whatever the adults are doing. Roman looked at the sleeping boy for a long time. Then he looked back at Vivian and said, with the careful voice of a man managing cracked ribs, "You made it to Whitmore." "We made it." "The drives." "Both delivered. She's had her people on them for 2 hours." She paused. "She's making the call about your immunity agreement tonight. Complete coverage. I asked for it." He looked at her. "You didn't need to do that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He looked around the room, the whiteboard, the table, the sleeping child, Elias, who he was meeting for the first time, and who gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who has spent 8 months building toward a moment and is now inside it, and finding that the inside of it is smaller and more fluorescent lit and more ordinary than the version he had been carrying in his head. 18 hours, Vivian said. "You held it." He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself because of the ribs or the bruise or both. 14, he said. "I gave it up at 14, but by then it didn't matter." "By then it didn't matter," he agreed. She crossed the room and put her arms around him carefully, aware of the ribs, and he stood very still for a moment and then put one hand briefly on her back, and then they separated and both of them looked at something other than each other, the way people do after they have acknowledged something that doesn't have adequate language. Damian Moretti was transferred to federal detention at 11:15. Vivian was not in the building when it happened. Whitmore had arranged the property she'd mentioned. A colleague's house, a real house with a kitchen and a bedroom and a yard, 40 minutes from the city. And Elias had driven her and Oliver there at 10:30, the boy asleep in the back seat with the elephant, the snow falling steadily now and accumulating on the road shoulders and the bare branches. She did not watch Damian leave the building. She found out about the transfer the next morning from Whitmore by phone. She listened to the information and said thank you and ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the borrowed house with a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the snow-covered yard. The arraignment was 3 weeks away. The hearing on permanent custody was 6 weeks away. The trial, depending on how the defense team structured its approach, could be a year or more. A long, expensive, carefully managed legal process that would eventually produce a verdict and a sentence and a period of incarceration that Roman's testimony and the financial documentation and Sal Benedetti's cooperation would make very long. She knew all of this. She also knew that knowledge of a process and the living of a process were different things, and that the next year would require a different kind of endurance than the past 6. Not the endurance of concealment, not the performance of contentment inside hostile walls, but the endurance of the open, of the scene, of standing in rooms and saying out loud what had happened and what had been done and what it had cost, in the flat American declarative that courtrooms require, without flinching and without embellishment. She had been practicing for that, she realized, for 6 years. She had been practicing saying true things quietly and without embellishment for 6 years inside a house where true things had no safe space. She was going to be very good at testimony. Oliver came downstairs at 7:30 in the pajamas with the tractors, dragging the elephant by one ear, his hair sideways from sleep. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the snow in the yard with the absolute focused delight of a child encountering fresh snow. And then he looked at Vivian and said, "Can we go outside?" "After breakfast." "What's for breakfast?" She opened the refrigerator. Whitmore's colleague had left it stocked. Eggs, bread, orange juice, several things a child might need. "Eggs," she said. "Scrambled?" "However you want them." He climbed onto a stool at the counter and put the elephant on the counter beside him and watched her with the comfortable attention of a child who has decided this kitchen is his and this morning is ordinary, which was the bravest thing she had seen in 6 days. She made eggs. She made them scrambled because that was what he wanted, and because she was still, in the new spaces of her life, learning to do things simply because someone she loved wanted them, without calculating the cost or the permission or the observation. She made eggs and toast, and she poured orange juice, and she sat across from him at the small table by the window, and they ate together in the new morning silence that was not the silence of absence or surveillance, but the silence of two people who are, for the first time in a long time, simply in a room together without anyone watching. The snow in the yard was unbroken. No footprints, no tracks. Just the flat white surface of it, covering the dormant grass and the bare garden beds and the branches of a large maple at the yard's center, each branch outlined in white against the gray winter sky. Oliver ate and looked at the snow and ate some more. "Mom," he said. "Yeah." "Are we going to stay here?" She looked at the yard. "For a little while. Then we're going to find our own place." "With a red garage door?" She looked at him. He was entirely serious. She thought about the drawing on the legal pad in the federal field office, the house with the tree and the elephant and the small square garage. She thought about a 5-year-old designing his own future on the back of someone else's paperwork, with the unself-conscious confidence of someone for whom the future is simply a place you make decisions about. "With a red garage door," she said. He seemed satisfied with this. He ate the rest of his toast. The months that followed were not gentle. They were not supposed to be, and Vivian had not built expectations of gentleness into her planning because she understood, clearly and without self-pity, that surviving something is not the same as recovering from it. And recovery is not a single event, but a long accumulation of ordinary mornings and difficult afternoons and nights that are sometimes fine and sometimes not. The custody hearing went in her favor, which was never really in doubt given the federal case running parallel, but going in your favor in a courtroom is not the same as easy. She sat in the witness box for a full day while a defense attorney she had to admit was technically skilled asked her questions designed to construct a version of the marriage that was manageable and mutual, and she answered each question in the flat declarative she had been practicing for 6 years. And when it was over, she sat in the car in the parking structure for 17 minutes before she was ready to drive. Roman testified over 3 days. She did not attend. She was not permitted in the courtroom during his testimony for procedural reasons, but Whitmore debriefed her each evening, and the picture that emerged from Roman's testimony was the picture she had always understood to exist but had never seen laid out in sequence. The full architecture of it, the shell companies and the political contributions, and the bodies that the money had financed, and the 12 years of meticulous record-keeping that had made it all possible. Roman wept once during his testimony. Once, on the second day when the prosecutor asked him to explain the purpose of a particular series of transactions that he had processed in 2019. He explained the purpose. He wept. He stopped weeping and continued explaining. The jury, Whitmore said, watched him very carefully during that minute and in the minutes after, and what they appeared to see was a man who had done something he could not undo and was not pretending otherwise. His immunity agreement covered his full exposure. Whitmore had made the call that night, as promised. Sal Benedetti cooperated fully and received a reduced sentence that was still measured in years. He did not speak to Damien before or after his testimony. There was apparently nothing left between them to say. Marco received 18 months for his role in the warehouse incident involving Roman, which was the only charge that could be made to stick against him directly. He served it without appealing and was released and, as far as Vivian knew, left the state. The Camden Avenue property was seized as part of the asset forfeiture. Caruso's claim on it was determined to be unenforceable given the circumstances of its transfer. Damien Moretti was sentenced on a Tuesday in October, 11 months after his arrest in the federal field office. Vivian didn't go to the sentencing. She had no legal obligation to attend and no personal need to be present for it. She had made her statement through testimony months earlier, and she understood that being in the room when a sentence was handed down would require her to have feelings about it in public, and the feelings she had about Damien Moretti were not available for public display. They were private and complicated, and not resolved, and probably never would be resolved completely, because 6 years leaves marks that don't simplify into anything clean. She was painting when Whitmore called with the sentence. She had set up a studio in the new house, her house, found and chosen and signed for in her name. A small place on the western shore of a lake, She had driven past one afternoon while running an errand and had stopped to look at and had understood, in the uncomplicated way of a body recognizing something the mind hasn't caught up to yet, that this was the direction she was going. She had rented and then eventually bought. She had painted the garage door red. She had put Oliver in a school where the teacher had called her at the end of the third week to say that Oliver was doing well and was very focused during art time, and could she suggest any good books about painting for young children, because Oliver had told her his mother painted and he wanted to learn. She had stood in the kitchen listening to the teacher and felt something she was still learning to feel without suspicion, simple happiness. The uncomplicated kind. The kind that doesn't require calculation. She was painting when Whitmore called. Watercolors on a large sheet of paper taped to the studio wall. An abstract thing, mostly blues and grays with an intrusion of warm color at the lower left that she hadn't fully understood yet but was leaving alone because she had learned that paintings sometimes know things before you do. She answered the phone with a clean hand, the right one. 22 years, Whitmore said. Federal, no parole eligibility for 14. She stood in the studio with the phone against her ear and looked at the painting. Okay, she said. The asset forfeiture is finalized. Your legal team should have the documentation by end of week. The paintings were inventoried as personal property. They're yours. A pause. I thought you'd want to know that specifically. The paintings. The pale coastal landscapes and color studies stacked on the rack in the sunroom of the Moretti estate. She had thought about them at odd moments over the past 11 months. Not with longing, exactly, but with the particular attention you pay to things that marked a period of your life you are still trying to understand. I'll arrange for them to be collected, she said. There's also a storage unit. The inventory lists approximately 40 paintings. I know how many there are. She did. She had painted every one of them in the specific privacy of early morning, and she knew each one the way you know things you made in difficult conditions. Not fondly, necessarily, but completely. Thank you, Helena, she said. She had started using the first name 3 months ago. Whitmore had not objected. If anything, she had seemed to find it a relief. Take care of yourself, Whitmore said, and that boy. She ended the call. She stood in the studio for a moment, the phone in her clean hand, looking at the painting on the wall. The blues and grays, the intrusion of warm color at the lower left that she still didn't fully understand. Outside the studio window, the lake was catching the October light, the low, specific light of autumn that doesn't illuminate so much as reveal, that finds the color in things you'd assumed were neutral and shows you they've been holding it all along. Oliver would be home from school in an hour. He would come through the door and drop his backpack in the hallway and ask about a snack, and then drift toward the studio doorway. Because he always did. Because he was a child who understood that where his mother was painting was the center of things, and he would stand in the doorway and look at what she was working on with the same serious attention he applied to everything, and then he would say something about it that was either very perceptive or completely beside the point, and she would not always be able to tell which, and that was fine. She turned back to the painting. She picked up the brush. The warm color at the lower left was still there, waiting. She had been working around it for 3 sessions, approaching and retreating, not yet certain of its nature. She looked at it now, and something shifted, the way things shift when you stop trying to understand them and simply look. She touched the brush to the paper. The color moved. It spread toward the center of the painting in a way she hadn't planned and couldn't have planned, finding its own path through the blues and grays with the specific assurance of something that knows where it's going, and she followed it, the brush moving with her breath, and the lake held the October light outside the window, and somewhere in the house the clock marked the afternoon. The painting opened. She let it. 40 minutes later, when the headlights of the school bus swept across the studio window and she heard the front door and the sound of a backpack hitting the hallway floor, she set the brush down and looked at what she had made. It was not the painting she had started with. It was something else, something with more warmth in it than she had intended, more movement, more of that insistent color that had found its way from the lower left toward the center and changed the whole nature of what the blues and grays were doing. It was not finished. It would take another session, maybe 2. But it was good. She knew it was good the way you know things you've made honestly. Not with pride exactly, but with the quiet recognition of something true. Oliver appeared in the doorway. He had his backpack still half on one shoulder and a cracker in his hand from wherever he'd found it, and he looked at the painting on the wall with the serious, focused attention she had come to depend on. "It's different than it was this morning," he said. "It changed." He looked at it for another moment. "I like it better," he decided. "Me too." He ate the cracker. He looked at the lake through the window. "Can we go down to the water before dinner?" "Get your jacket." He left. She heard the closet door and the small sounds of a 5-year-old negotiating with a jacket zipper, and then his footsteps back down the hall. She took off her studio apron and hung it on the hook by the door. She washed the brush and set it to dry. She looked at the painting one more time. The warm color had reached the center. It was there now, in the middle of all that blue and gray, not loud, not insistent, just present, undeniable, the kind of thing that, once you see it, you can't understand how the painting existed without it. She turned off the studio light and went to find her son. Outside, the lake held the last of the October light, and the red garage door was the brightest thing on the street, and the afternoon was cold and clear and entirely their own.